Hi, I'm Dan Rockmore, Director of the William H. Neukom Institute for Computational Science here at Dartmouth College, and on behalf of the college and the Neukom Institute, I'd like to welcome you to this year's Spring Donoho Colloquium, Habeas Data, Privacy versus the Rise of Surveillance Tech, from Cyrus Farivar, author, radio producer, and investigative reporter with NBC News. The Donoho Colloquium is an ongoing series of public lectures aimed at increasing awareness of the many important and sometimes surprising places in which computational ideas are shaping our lives. These events are made possible by a generous gift from David, Mickey, and Dan Donoho in honor of Dan's graduation as a member of the class of 2006. It is the central piece of the larger mission of the Neukom Institute, whose aim is to support and integrate computational thinking and computational ideas throughout the Dartmouth community. The Institute itself is made possible through the generosity of Bill Neukom, Dartmouth class of '64 and former trustee of the college. One of the most fascinating and disturbing societal shifts fostered by the digital has occurred in the notion of privacy. Arguably, one narrative of modernity, at least up to a point, was one, at least in Western cultures, of increased privacy. A steady march away from tribal living, the goal of personal land and home ownership. Technology also played into that, to the point that everything you want and need to do could be accomplished literally in the palm of your hand, whenever and wherever you are. Everything personal, everything private, all the time. Except it isn't. The fact is that the medium of privacy, the ability to carry your life in your pocket, has come with an ironic cost, that our lives, now inextricably tied to the internet, the web, and the cloud, are actually more public than they ever were. And with shifts in cultural norms, it isn't a concern to many until suddenly it is. The facts of your existence are now available to many people, sometimes for free, sometimes for a fee, and sometimes through a court order. The last of these brings us to the subject of today's lecture. How has our transference of our physical presence to a digital presence changed the judicial possibility of privacy? Or more precisely, we now live in a world in which you are your data, and so much about you has been and is continuously being surrendered by you, either willingly or unwittingly, be it through the terms of service we all click through to gain access to wireless networks and shopping sites, or our wandering around the world with handheld tracking devices. In such a world, how has our constitutional right to privacy held up? Today's Donoho Colloquium speaker, Cyrus Farivar, is an award-winning journalist, currently an investigative tech reporter at NBC News in San Francisco. He's known for his clear and incisive writing on the darker side of the internet and modern technology and their interactions with society and the law. Cyrus received his BA in political economy from the University of California, Berkeley, and his master's from Columbia University in journalism. From 2010 until 2012, Cyrus was the Sci-Tech Editor and host of Spectrum at Deutsche Welle English, Germany's international broadcaster. He's also reported for a broad range of outlets, including the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, NPR, PRI, The Economist, Wired, and the New York Times, among others. Before joining NBC, Cyrus was a senior tech policy reporter at Ars Technica. In 2007, Cyrus and Joe Mullin won the Technology Reporting Award from the Society of Professional Journalists of Northern California for their story, Stealing Bitcoins with Badges, How Silk Road's Dirty Cops Got Caught. Cyrus's first book, The Internet of Elsewhere, looked at the role of the internet as a catalyst in transforming communications, politics, and economics, and was described by The Atlantic magazine as, quote, essential, unquote.
There's one copy of it outside, just one.
Buy it. Cyrus's second book, Habeas Data, from Melville Press, is the subject of today's lecture. The New Yorker called it a, quote, lively history of recent Fourth Amendment jurisprudence, and we look forward to learning more from him about the crucially important topic of privacy in the law. Please join me in welcoming our 2019 Spring Donoho Colloquium speaker, Cyrus Farivar.
Thanks very much. Hey, how you guys doing? What's going on? I want to say thank you very much to the Dartmouth community. Thank you very much to the Neukom Institute. Thank you
very much for that fine introduction. And thank to all of you beautiful people for sharing some of your evening with me. You know, I was just saying earlier, I have never been to New Hampshire until yesterday. I just arrived from the West Coast. And for me, you know, New Hampshire, I really don't know anything about New Hampshire, to be honest. And, you know, one of the things that I do know about New Hampshire is that you guys have this very strong message on your license plates that I've noticed. Live free or die, which is almost threatening in a way. But I think it's really interesting because I think that the ethos that I have started to get an inkling of here in New Hampshire, I think speaks to some of the concerns that perhaps you and certainly your forebears had, you know, against kind of the early American, you know, form of government. And as I was trying to educate myself about kind of what's going on here in New Hampshire with respect to privacy, I came across a couple of things that maybe you already know, but they were new to me. One, your state law bans the use of facial recognition by your what we in California would call the Department of Motor Vehicles. I don't know if you call it the same thing here, but you know, wherever you register your car and stuff. So in neighboring Massachusetts, they use it all the time, and they use it to arrest people who are committing identity fraud and various things. But your state law currently bans the use of facial recognition by the DMV. Is it called the DMV? I think it's called DMV, right? Okay. Also, late last year, your state constitution was amended to include an affirmative right to privacy. So you mentioned the federal right to privacy. There actually is no federal right to privacy. A handful of states, including your state and mine, California, have an affirmative right to privacy. So in your, I'm sure you guys all know, Article 2, Section B, in your state constitution, it says, an individual's right to live free from governmental intrusion in private or personal information is natural, essential, and inherent. So that was adopted as of December 5, 2018. And it's really fun, actually, as a Californian to read the New Hampshire State Constitution because I was telling somebody earlier, you know, there's a lot of parts that say, like, you know, established 1784 or whatever, and then it says, like, amended 2015 or something. So, like, it's really fun to see kind of that difference. So you have the state ban on facial recognition. You have the affirmative right to privacy. That's awesome. You also have, and I'm going to talk about this more in a minute, one of my favorite pieces of technology to write and blather on about is something called license plate readers. How many of you guys are familiar with license plate readers? Okay, so a lot of you. That's great. I don't know if you know, but New Hampshire, so one of the things that's super interesting about how license plate readers work and how they're used by different law enforcement agencies is that there's actually no standard rule about how long the data from law enforcement, from license plate readers should be kept. So in California, the California Highway Patrol, I believe, has a retention policy, as it's called, of 6 months. So if you're not, you know, being part of an investigation, when they scan your license plate as you drive by, the California CHP will keep it for 6 months. In Oakland, California, where I live, up till just a couple of years ago, the city of Oakland had no policy at all, which meant that in practice they were keeping data for 4 or 5 years. And this varies wildly from city to city, from county to county, from state to state. Here in New Hampshire, do you guys know how long your law enforcement can keep this data for? 3 minutes. 3 minutes. That's the shortest of any state in the union, right? So your police, by state law, can capture your plate and keep it for 3 minutes unless it's part of an investigation. That's amazing. This ethos of kind of live free or die kind of continues and manifests itself in different ways. And I just wanted to give you one more piece of news that I found really interesting when I was, you know, literally doing Google News searches for New Hampshire surveillance last night. So there was a short item in the Associated Press about drones in the town of Portsmouth. And I'm just going to read you just a very short bit from that. It says, police officials on Tuesday, this is just this past Tuesday, heard plans for a 3-officer team to lead a drone program run by the Portsmouth Police Department, but available to area communities. That means they're going to loan out their drones to other agencies. They also heard about plans to address privacy rights while using drones during emergencies and large crowd events. Police Officer James Norrie, Lieutenant Christian Cummings, and Detective Eric Widerstrom are starting the drone program with a $70,000 Homeland Security grant. It was announced during the April 23rd Police Commission meeting. So that means federal dollars gave $70,000 to the Portsmouth Police Department to buy drones. That's really interesting because that's actually how a lot of this type of technology enters our communities. Whether big cities or small cities, all across the country, this happens all the time. And this is something that I think we really need to think about and pay more attention to in our different communities. It mentioned the federal grant. Oftentimes what happens is a city council, a county government, maybe a state government, a representative law enforcement will come to that lawmaking body and they'll say, hey, we got this free money from the feds and we want to accept it. It doesn't cost the local taxpayer anything. And we want to buy drones, or we want to buy stingrays, which is like a cell phone surveillance device, or we want to buy license plate readers or whatever. And 9 times out of 10, the policymakers would be like, oh yeah, that's cool, go do that. And then nothing, like, you don't hear anything more, right? Oftentimes, I could be wrong, but I would not be surprised if the good people of the Portsmouth Police Department have not yet written a policy as to how they're going to actually use these drones, and where and how and under what circumstances they will use them, where and how they're going to loan them out to other agencies and other cities and other communities in the region. Where I live in Oakland, the city of Oakland does not own its own drones, but they borrow drones from the county sheriff all the time. So it's really interesting to think about kind of how these technologies are used practically. My book, Habeas Data, for sale outside. You guys are the first people to be able to buy the new paperback, so it's cheaper than it used to be, so that's good. My book, Habeas Data, is about 10 legal cases that cover 50 years from 1967 to 2017. Mostly Supreme Court cases, but not exclusively. And the reason why I start in 1967 is because there's a case there called Katz versus United States, K-A-T-Z versus United States, which is where we get this phrase that maybe some of you have heard. Raise your hand if you've heard the phrase reasonable expectation of privacy. A few people, a lot of people. Okay, great. Raise your hand if you know the story of where that phrase comes from. Great, then I have a story to tell you. Charles Katz was this interesting guy who made a living somehow making illegal bets on sports teams living in Los Angeles. He lived on Sunset Boulevard in a high-rise building, and he liked to walk down the street just a few blocks away to go to a bank of phone booths, and he would make calls to his bookies on the East Coast. And he bet primarily on college basketball and college football. This was 1965. And he used to wear, just nice suits, and you wouldn't even notice who he was. You wouldn't have paid him any mind had you seen him at the time. He did this so often that he drew the attention of the Los Angeles Police Department and the FBI. The LAPD especially was interested in this because they viewed, vice crimes, gambling and prostitution and things like that, as a way to put a check against corrupt police. And in fact, one of the officers who I spoke with, who I interviewed for the book, a guy named Joseph Gunn, which is a great name for a cop, by the way. Joseph Gunn told me that Katz, that Gunn had previously reported his own police partner previously, who had been indicted for corruption about a year or so earlier than the Katz case. So this was something that the LAPD was very interested in. So they watched him. They monitored his movements as he walked around Sunset Boulevard in Hollywood. They decided that they were going to catch this guy in the act by placing a recording device on top of 2 of the phone booths of the bank of 3 that he liked to use. I don't know if they only had the budget for 2. We don't know. But because this is 1965 technology, and sadly, if you've ever read court documents, they tend not to have a lot of pictures. So what I imagine is, these big audio reels that are about probably yay big, right? And so they had somebody climb up onto the phone booth, place this recording thing, place a microphone up there on 2 of the booths. The third one they took care of using a really sophisticated technology known as a piece of paper with a marker, which is where they wrote out of order and they just taped it to one of the booths. Again, we don't know why. I don't know if they just didn't have the budget for 3. I don't know what the deal was. But that's what they did. So they put those up there. They had a team of agents. They would watch him walk a few blocks over from here to there, climb up, and when he, a few minutes before he came down to the booth, it was somebody's job to climb up to this thing, press record, and listened to this guy's calls as he was making his sports bets. And the court record shows, he said things like, give me a nickel on Donetsk, which means bet $5,000 on Donetsk basketball, I think. I don't know anything about Donetsk. But so they did this for 6 days, and the police took great pains to actually turn the recorder off when he left, so they only were recording him. And eventually, they decided, okay, they had enough information, they were going to go arrest Charles Katz. So our good friend Joseph Gunn walks over with some other officers. They arrest him at the phone booth. They've got him, red-handed or red-tongued, I guess. They have all these recordings of him making these bets. So they arrest him. Gunn tells me that Katz was very polite. He didn't resist. He didn't talk back to the officers. He was very sort of acquiescent. They walked him back to his apartment a few blocks away. They had a warrant to search the apartment. And this is an interesting point because the police did not have a warrant to put the microphones and the recording devices on top of the phone booths. But the police did not, and the FBI did not think that they needed to. If you read you remember the Fourth Amendment of the Constitution, it protects against unreasonable searches and seizures, right? I don't know how many lawyers are in the room, but something that non-lawyers such as myself, sometimes don't fully understand is that there are lots of things in the world that are not considered searches, right? So the Constitution doesn't protect against all searches, it just protects against unreasonable ones. What's a reasonable search? A reasonable search is a search that is, where there's a warrant, right, to search somebody's house, right? Another reasonable search is sometimes called a consent search, right? So if you get pulled over by the police and the police say, hey, can I search your trunk? And you say yes, you've consented to the search, right? So that's okay, they don't need a warrant for that. So in the case of this recording device on top of the phone booth, the police did not consider that to be a search. And the reason is because at that time, the 1965 we're talking about, the bulk of Fourth Amendment law, the bulk of kind of Fourth Amendment cases at that time, really turned on a question of physical trespass into physical space. So the case that most closely dealt with this prior was about 40 years earlier in the 1920s. This was a case out of Seattle called Olmsted. Roy Olmsted was a Seattle police officer who decided that he wasn't making enough money as police officer and decided that he wanted to go into bootlegging because that's what you do when it's prohibition and you live near the border. So he starts running liquor from Canada into the Northwest, and eventually the prohibition agents and authorities there, they set up a wiretap on the phone line to his house. Ultimately, he gets arrested. He challenges the use of the wiretap. And when the case gets to the Supreme Court, in this case called Olmsted versus United States, in a majority opinion written by Chief Justice William Howard Taft, which next time you play, legal pub trivia, Chief Justice Taft was the guy who used to be president before he was Chief Justice. He was the big dude got stuck in a bathtub with a big mustache, like that guy. So he's the only president and also Supreme Court justice. So fun fact. So Chief Justice Taft said in the Olmsted case, the bootlegging case, he said that the use of the wiretap was fine because there was no searching, there was no seizure. Because what they did was they listened to sound over an ethereal wire. They didn't actually cross over his property, so it was fine. This was what the court said. Now, and also this is 40 years before the Wiretap Act of 1968, what's sometimes called a Title III wiretap. So if we go back to our friend Katz in LA in the 60s, this is what one of the main cases that the court was having to consider was this Olmsted case from Seattle from 40 years earlier. So that's why the police and the FBI put these microphones not inside the phone booth, because they didn't penetrate the airspace of the phone booth, but they put them on top. So that's under the government's thinking at the time, not a search, totally fine. So they didn't need a warrant. So when they go and they arrest him, the Katz's attorneys, they challenge the use of these microphones. They say, hey, this is unconstitutional, this violates the Fourth Amendment. They lose at the district court level. They lose at the appellate court level, the Ninth Circuit. They appeal up to the Supreme Court. The court agrees to hear the case. The Supreme Court, as some of you probably know, the Supreme Court only hears a tiny fraction of cases that are sent to it, something like 1%, maybe less. They agree to hear the case. In 1967, the court hears the case and ultimately issues this ruling saying that Charles Katz had a reasonable expectation of privacy when he stepped into the phone booth. He expected that his phone calls would be private in the same way that when he's in a taxi, in a hotel room, in his office, in his home, that he would expect privacy. And if the government wanted to surveil him, they needed a warrant to do that. The search of his apartment was fine, but the search of the phone booth was not fine in the court's eyes. So now we have this interesting standard of a reasonable expectation of privacy, which, again, because our lawyer friends love to kind of parse and dissect a lot of these words, we get it today, and this question still resonates with us. What does reasonable mean? What does an expectation mean? Is it okay to expect privacy if you walk down the street and the police put cameras every few feet and there's signs saying that you're under surveillance? Do you expect privacy then? I don't know. But we have we don't have an affirmative right to privacy as you do in your state constitution and as we do in California. Federally speaking, we don't have that. We have bits and pieces of it. When it comes to privacy law on a federal scale, we have different laws that address different elements of privacy. We have, you guys are probably familiar with HIPAA, right? The Health Privacy Act, right? So you go to the doctor can't text you your medical records, things have to be HIPAA compliant and so on. We have the Federal Privacy Act from the 1970s that has to do with release of certain records. We have other privacy acts having to do with financial data and other kinds of things. But we don't have this affirmative right to privacy in that respect. We do have the Constitution that protects us from government intrusion, the Fourth Amendment being chief among them. But we also have other parts of the Constitution and our founding documents that, again, sort of intuit a right to privacy, if you will. For example, you might remember the Third Amendment, which is often forgotten. The Third Amendment protects us against the quartering of soldiers in our home. And if you think about why that was so important to our colonial forebears, that they not have soldiers quartering in your home, is guess what? Nobody likes to have guests, particularly big dudes with guns who want to, drink and hang out in your barn or whatever while they're, at war. That's very invasive to personal space and is an affront to, I think, our notion of privacy. So actually, the Third Amendment, although it doesn't get cited very often, it has been cited as a precedent for having this kind of, like I said, this kind of intuited right to privacy, even though it's not explicit in the law. So when we get from the right to privacy to, that's just one of the cases that I write about, is this Katz case. That's actually the first chapter of the book. And I kind of take you guys through these different cases going all the way to the end, to 2017, which is a case that I'll talk about briefly before I move back to license plate readers. The most recent case that I write about is a case called Carpenter versus United States. And if you ever listened to the podcast Planet Money, they did a really great episode on this case. So Little Tim Carpenter was the leader of this basically armed robbery gang in Michigan and Ohio that was operating circa 2010, 2011. And it operated just like any other armed robbery gang would. They had guns. They had laundry bags. They would walk into a Radio Shack or a cell phone store, and it was a stick-up, and they were going after the latest Samsung Galaxy, whatever smartphone, and the latest iPhone and stuff, threw them in the bag and ran off. They hit a bunch of stores in Michigan and Ohio. Eventually, the local authorities and eventually federal authorities got onto them. One of the other members of this crew gave up the phone number of Little Tim Carpenter. And it's important to distinguish Little Tim because in this gang, for some reason, there were two other guys named Tim. There was Big Tim and Tim Tim. I don't know why you need three different Tims in a gang, but whatever. So Little Tim, they gave up Little Tim's number. With that number, the authorities went to Metro PCS. There was a mention of court orders earlier. They went to Metro PCS and they presented Metro PCS with something called a D order, which is a particular section of the federal law known as the Stored Communications Act. And this D order says, that a company like Metro PCS has to turn over subscriber data when the government presents it with this order. And this is not the same thing as a warrant. It doesn't require a showing of probable cause of a crime. It merely requires showing relevancy to an ongoing investigation, which could be basically anything. And so what Metro PCS did was they gave the government 127 days worth of his what's called cell site location information. So right, all of our phones are constantly talking to the nearest cell phone tower, and they're giving up their location to the tower. You can sort of think of this, if you're not already familiar with it, like the children's swimming game Marco Polo, right? So like your phone is shouting Marco, and the tower is shouting back Polo, or maybe it's the other way around. I don't know, but basically, right, in order for your phone to have service, it needs to know where the tower is, right, and vice versa. So what Metro PCS gave up was 127 days of extremely granular information transmitted every few seconds for 127 days. So they showed that, yes, he was at the scenes of the crimes, but also that he was at church on Sundays, and also that he was at his grandma's house other days, and also that he slept at places that were not his known residence other days. And it told the police a lot of other information about him beyond the fact that he was associated with these crimes. Ultimately, that case went up to the Supreme Court, and the court recently, just in 2018, ruled that the government did need a warrant to get this level of detailed information, which the law didn't require previously. So that's the kind of scope and scale of that. I wanted to go back just a little bit to a case, one of my favorite cases from the events took place in like the late 70s, and it was decided in 1982. And this was a case called Knott's, Knotts, like Knott's Berry Farm, if you've ever been to that in Southern California. How many of you guys watch Breaking Bad or Better Call Saul? All right, cool. So in Breaking Bad, right, there's like the Walter White chemist type of character. He's the like master drug lord. There's the Gus Fring, distributor type character. The Knott's case is basically Breaking Bad in Minnesota in the 70s. So everybody has ridiculous mustaches, I'm assuming. But there's this guy named Knott's. There's another guy named Petchin. But they fulfilled kind of the same roles as in Breaking Bad. There's this kind of down on his luck chemist. There's this distributor guy, and so they're making meth all over the Twin Cities. The Minnesota authorities are onto them. The DEA is onto them. They're moving locations constantly. Eventually, they decide that what they're going to do is they are going to actually move entirely out of state. And so they decide to buy a drum, like an oil drum-sized amount of chloroform, which I guess is a thing that you need to make meth. I've never tried. But they legally purchase this amount of chloroform, and the police decide to put a beeper, what's described in court documents as a beeper, and this isn't like from the Wire, 1990s pager. This is like a tiny radio transmitter, like a mini like Sputnik. Like all it's doing is just emitting like a radio signal. And again, we don't have pictures, but I sort of imagine that these cops, in the 70s had this little tiny, black and green screen is doing like a little like, radar like in a submarine movie, like just giving off a little blip. Like that's all it's doing. Like they don't have like, Google Maps or whatever. So they're tracking these guys as they load up this drum. They drive it around Minneapolis, and then they start driving out of town. And they follow in a police car down the highway. At one point, they lose the signal. They have to call in a helicopter, which is amazing, and to track them further. They track them for 100 miles all the way to a place called Shell Lake, Wisconsin, to where they have a little cabin there. And the police stake out the cabin. They stake it out for 3 days. They get a warrant to search the cabin. They go into the cabin and they find the secret drug lab. And because of course, when you're a Minnesota/Wisconsin, drug gang, you need like a secret wall in your secret cabin to make your secret meth. So behind the secret wall, they found all this stuff to make meth. The defense lawyers challenged the use of the tracking device, right, from Minnesota to Wisconsin, and they said, "Hey, you need a warrant for that." And the government was like, no, you don't. We had permission to install it on the drum. It's totally fine. So the case gets challenged up to the appellate court, to the 8th Circuit. So I'm just going to read to you just a little bit from what this case is about. In short, the 8th Circuit indicated that while Petchin, one of the defendants, was known to authorities beforehand as a person of interest as part of the Armstrong investigation, the case against Knott's was entirely pursued as a result of the search of his farm. As the court, in a 2-to-1 ruling, concluded, quote, The difficulty in applying the test of legitimate expectations of privacy in electronic surveillance cases is that consideration of such expectations leads almost ineluctably to the philosophical question whether the constitutional protections of privacy must or should diminish with technological innovations in surveillance. Knots, as the resident of the property, could certainly have a reasonable, legitimate expectation of privacy in the kind and location of objects out of public view on his land. With Petchin, this is not so. So they're basically saying Petchin is separated from the case, but Knots, because he owned the cabin, he had a right to challenge this. The government, unsatisfied that Knots might be allowed to go free, appealed the case to the Supreme Court. In the 1982 term, I was born in January 1982 for some perspective, the court was nearly the same as it was during an earlier case I read about called Smith versus Maryland, with the notable exception of Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, who had just joined the court months earlier. A Reagan-nominated conservative jurist, O'Connor was the first female justice ever on the Supreme Court. At oral arguments, which were held on December 6, 1982, early questions for Deputy Solicitor General Andrew Fry turned to the specifics of the case and whether somebody else might be able to hear the signal emitted by the beeper. But Fry quickly drove home his point, again echoing Katz. This is the LA phone booth case, right? This is not a search in the traditional sense, he said to the court. It is not the uninvited eye or the uninvited ear that is seeing or hearing what is going on in private areas. In fact, all that is examined in this search is the airwaves around the receiver being operated by the officers. Now, of course, Katz teaches that even such activity may be considered a search regulated by the Fourth Amendment, but whether it is depends on whether what is disclosed by this kind of activity is private or non-private information. Ultimately, the court found that there was no, well, here, I'll just skip to this part. Here's what the court ruled. A person traveling in an automobile on public thoroughfares has no reasonable expectation of privacy in his movements. The justices wrote, overturning the Eighth Circuit's ruling for the would-be meth dealer. Law enforcement agencies have seized on this line as their legal justification for license plate readers, which did not exist in 1982. Today, we now live in a world where your state government, in its infinite wisdom, has decided that the appropriate length of time to retain that data is 3 minutes because of this case. Because some dudes were dealing meth in Minnesota in the 70s. And it's kind of amazing that you hear, and this is why there's such great disparity between different agencies in different places, is because they say, look, there's no reasonable expectation of privacy in public, so we can scan license plates all day long. It's not a search. We don't need a warrant. It's fine. If that logic is true, if we as a society accept that and believe that, and haven't changed the law in any other way, then it's also true, I think, that we are rapidly approaching a near future where body cameras that are in use by law enforcement in the city where I live, in Oakland, all patrol officers are supposed to have body cameras. I don't know about here. But many, many, many cities in America increasingly have body cameras. Those body cameras really soon are going to have facial recognition capabilities. If it's true that we have no reasonable expectation of privacy in public, then it's also true that the police can and will certainly claim that they can scan everyone's faces in public. And if you have any government-issued ID, if you have a driver's license, if you have a passport, if you have a city or state ID, the government already has a really good picture of you and me. And so that's where we're at right now, is there are lots of technologies, and if you look on the back cover, and what was alluded to earlier, is that there are lots of kind of situations in which these technologies are enabled by these much older precedents that I don't think we have fully grappled with in many instances. And so that brings me to sort of my final point, and which is, and not to spoil the ending of my own book, which is that, you know, in Oakland, we have tried to come up with a solution for this problem. I talked earlier about this issue of getting grants and buying all of these technologies, the facial recognition, the drones, all this kind of stuff, right? So what do you do about it when your police department comes to you and says, oh, hey, we accepted 70 grand to buy some drones, you know, hope that's cool. In Oakland, we have developed a system where we have a privacy advisory commission. The Oakland Privacy Advisory Commission is a body that acts just like the Planning Commission or the Parks Commission or any other city commission. The commissioners are appointed by the mayor. They represent all the geographic city council districts. There's a non-voting mayor who's a liaison to the city, and there's a non-voting mayor, or there's a non-voting member who's a liaison to the city, and there's a non-voting member who's a liaison to the police. And they have regular meetings, they have regular minutes. You can sign up for their minutes and agendas if you want to, even though you live here. And they try in a meaningful, important civic dialogue-minded kind of way to discuss with police and city officials as to how to balance the needs of civil liberties while also trying to give the police the tools that they need to solve crimes. If you know anything about the city of Oakland, you may know that it's a city of 400,000 people where the police department, by any measure, has far less officers than it needs. For the last several years, on average, something like 80 people get murdered every year. We have serious violent crime, we have property crime, we have all kinds of crime that happens in Oakland and lots of other cities too. So there's a certain need to have the police go after particularly violent, serious crime. Nobody wants murders in their town. But at the same time, Oakland is also a place that gave rise to the Black Panthers, who themselves were surveilled by the federal government under what was often called the COINTEL program, the counterintelligence program in the 70s. And many communities, particularly communities of color, oftentimes feel over-surveilled. So there's a definite sensitivity to the use of these kinds of technologies. And this blew up in Oakland in a really kind of interesting way in 2013, right after we all learned the name Edward Snowden in June 2013. It just so happened that like a week or so later, one of these federal grants was about to be approved before the city of Oakland. The city of Oakland was about to sign off on something called the Domain Awareness Center, where in the name of port security, if you look at a map of Oakland, Oakland is one of the major ports on the West Coast. It's actually the 5th largest port in the country. So we have cargo ships running in and out all the time. And so they were going to approve this surveillance measure to do port security, to do more license plate readers, more cameras, more all kinds of stuff, because, terrorists hate cargo ships, I guess. And so there was this federal money that the city was about to sign off on, and people had just learned about Edward Snowden and were just starting to kind of get galvanized and starting to think about surveillance in our own communities. And this was actually the very first Oakland City Council meeting I ever went to. I don't know what your city council meetings are like, but in Oakland, they can go real late, and people get real loud and real angry. And so at about 12:45 in the morning, 1 in the morning, the city approved to accept this money, and people were yelling shame from the balconies, people were protesting and yelling and screaming, and eventually that kind of energy was turned into something called the Oakland Privacy Working Group, which over time became a local activist group that was very concerned about privacy. And I tell the story in the book of a guy named Brian Hofer, who was a young activist who comes from Siskiyou County in the far north of California on the border with Oregon. He describes his own politics as a mix of kind of rural libertarianism with Bay Area progressivism. And he was very interested in this issue and went to one of these privacy meetings. And all of these people that were, I think, well-intentioned didn't really have a good sense of like how they were going to actually enact the privacy policies that they wanted to enact. He told me that they were only interested in doing protests and street theater and stuff like that. And so he almost walked out of this meeting because he was so frustrated by it and he thought they weren't going to get anything done. And a local privacy lawyer pulled him aside and said, he had asked the group, he had said, well, have you guys met with anybody from the city council? And they said no. And when they said no, he was about to leave and he got pulled aside by somebody who said, hey, why don't you meet with the city council? And he sort of reminded him, in the Bay Area, we have a number of these what are called hacker spaces. These are kind of maker spaces, hacker spaces, where people get together and build stuff and teach each other. One of the key tenets of a hackerspace in San Francisco is called NoiseBridge. And one of their primary tenets is, if you want something done, do it. It's a do-ocracy. And so this is what they were sort of imparting to this guy, Brian, was, hey, if you want to meet with the city council, you should. And a few weeks later, he did. And eventually, a couple years later, the Oakland Privacy Advisory Commission was born, and he's still the head of it. He came that close to walking out of a meeting, and that would have never happened. They're constantly talking with law enforcement about how to update their policies, about how to think about privacy in new ways. Literally, just as I was walking into this room, I got an email about the meeting that they're having later this week about talking about different policies that they're working on. I just wanted to read you, they're sending around this draft of the City of Oakland Privacy Principles. And I'm not aware of any other city that has a commission like this or has thought about these issues in this kind of way before. And I hope that other communities in other areas start to think about this. So I just want to read you just the first two paragraphs of this that they just sent out tonight, the City of Oakland Privacy Principles. Oakland is a diverse city with a history of active civic participation on issues of privacy and surveillance. As we evolve, it is imperative that we learn from both the positive and negative aspects of our past to build our future. Progress at the expense of personal privacy and safety is unacceptable. We recognize the need to protect Oaklanders' privacy as city services incorporate emerging technologies. Privacy is a fundamental human right, a California state right, and instrumental to Oaklanders' safety, health, security, and access to city services. We seek to safeguard the privacy of every Oakland resident in order to promote fairness and protect civil liberties across all of Oakland's diverse communities. In all situations, we pledge to handle personal information in a manner that builds trust and preserves Oaklanders' privacy and safety. The following privacy principles guide our actions, and it goes on from there. I think that's a really positive statement. And I think that this is something that we need to see more of in our communities. And it's lucky for me that this is happening in my own backyard. Because I mentioned the Carpenter case earlier, right? So if you remember our friends who were robbing the Radio Shacks with Big Tim Carpenter, that case was decided in 2018. The events of that case happened in 2010, 2011. I don't know about you, but my iPhone has gotten really great in the last 8 years. And surveillance technology in general, has gotten really good really fast, right? Facial recognition is getting really good really fast. Other kinds of technologies are developing rapidly. So the reason why I mention that is that we cannot wait for the US Supreme Court, the state Supreme Court, local courts. We can't wait for them to tell us that this action or that action is inappropriate. We can't wait for something to happen after the fact. I think we all of our communities, all of our states, ideally the federal government, need to do, I think, a lot more on the front end to say, all right, these are our goals, these are the tools we need to achieve those goals, and here are the restrictions that we're placing. Because for now, we have not had that. We have not had communities that have stepped up and said, hey, we want to impose, I guess you guys have done the 3 seconds with the license plate readers, which is awesome, or 3 minutes, excuse me. But the fact that those policies vary so wildly, I think, is very indicative of that fact. And so, if you're unaware of what is going on in your own community, if you don't know how many license plate readers are in use in Hanover or wherever you come from, you can file a public records request. You can call the ACLU of New Hampshire. You can talk to your local friendly lawyers or your local friendly journalists. We're out here. Filing records request doesn't require any superpower or any magic skill or any magic credential. Anybody can do it. And literally all you have to do is say, dear, the clerk of public records for the chief of police or the police department of whatever, please send me all the purchase orders or invoices for the drones that you've purchased or whatever. Or please send me the privacy policy for the license plate readers, whatever. You can ask for that. And I think once we start to understand and appreciate the types of technologies that are in our own communities, then we can start to work with, I think, our local law enforcement and our government officials to build better policies that take into account some of these concerns so that we don't have to wait so many years for the courts to tell us what we should do and how we should live. So with that, I will stop there, and I'm happy to take questions, and I really appreciate your time.
I'm going to let Cyrus pick the questioners. There are mics around.
Okay.
So, if you could
There's a gentleman in the back with a mic.
the mic,
All right.
yeah, that'd be great.
Okay.
Hi there.
Hi.
So I actually listened to your book this weekend, I was on a couple long hikes, and
Great.
I was running Audible and Strava at the same time. So I actually have a geo-tagged referenced version of listening to your book, which is interesting. So thanks for the book. I have a question to you. Just today, I saw an op-ed in the New York Times written by Josephine Wolf. And basically, the argument is that with our data out there all the time, like the example I just gave, for example, our sense of privacy is eroding. Like everybody now knows, they know everything about me anyway, right? So our expectation of privacy goes down, which then gives the government basically the argument, well, that's not a reasonable expectation of privacy anymore, right? She's tracking what she's listening where and what her heartbeat is at the time. So what do you make of that argument?
Yeah, I think that's a really fair point. I think that, it was mentioned earlier that I lived in Germany for a couple years. And one of the things that I learned about my experience of living in Germany is that it seems to me that in Europe in general and Germany specifically have a different kind of attitude with respect to privacy than we do, I think, in this country by default. I arrived in Germany in the spring of 2010 when Google Street View had just arrived in Germany. And I don't know if you guys remember when Google Street View came out in this country, but if you think about what Google Street View is, it's pictures of everyone's house on the internet that's updated like twice a year everywhere in this country. And most of us were like, yeah, cool, that's fine. Like, nothing happened, right? Like, we're okay with it, generally. I'm sure people wrote angry letters to the editor or whatever at the time. But, generally speaking, we've kind of accepted it. So as Americans, I would say our default position is to be more skeptical of government power. That's like baked into our founding documents, right? Congress shall not do this. You guys have live free or die. I mean, it's right there. We're very skeptical of government power, and we're generally speaking more accepting of private power. In Germany and in Europe, I think generally it's sort of the opposite. People are resistant to corporate power, more so, and more accepting, generally, of government power. One of the things that I experienced in Germany when I first arrived was having to register myself at the city hall when I arrived in the country. And later on, when I moved apartments across town, I had to do it again. And when I left the country for good, I had to do it again. I had to show up in person with my passport and be like, hi, here I am. You can register me. OK, bye. Like, that was it. And everybody has to do this, not just because I was a foreigner. Germans have to do this, and I would tell my German friends, like, this is so weird. I have to go to City Hall. And they're like, yeah, whatever. It's normal. It's fine. Everybody does it. But I was thinking, like, imagine in this country, if every time you moved residences, you had to present yourself to a government officer just to do that. I think people would lose their mind. Like, I think people would, like, really freak out if you had to do that. Even though, like, if you pay taxes and you have a driver's license, the government already has your address anyway. But so to go back to your question, do we have a reasonable expectation of privacy when it comes to giving up certain amounts of information? I think that generally speaking, like with Strava, for example, right, we're generally okay with it, right? The reasonable expectation of privacy is protecting us from the government. It doesn't protect us, and the Constitution doesn't protect us from what we voluntarily surrender, nor does it protect us from each other, right? If I fly a drone over your house, the Constitution has nothing to say about that. You might be upset, but the Constitution has nothing to do with that. And I've written about instances where people have flown drones over people's farms or properties and stuff, and people have shot them down. Don't do that, by the way. It's really illegal. But that gets into a whole nother weird area of the law, which is that under current law, the concept of aerial trespass does not exist. So if I fly a drone over your house, I have not trespassed onto your land because I'm not on the land. I'm like in the air. And so like there's many areas of the law where we haven't fully found the answer yet. Which goes back to my earlier point that we need more regulation on the front end or more laws, more rules on the front end. But you're right. I think that when you provide and when you volunteer information about that, the government can and probably will use it against you if you are suspected of a crime. Or if you're undocumented, can and may use it to find you and deport you. In the Bay Area, I don't know about out here, but this question of license plate readers, a lot of cities, including Oakland, Berkeley, Davis, Santa Clara County, many other places, cities only recently, like within the last year, are starting to figure out that this technology that they use to find stolen cars, wanted cars, license plate readers, are also being used to find undocumented immigrants. And a lot of communities are like, wait, we didn't sign up for that. We didn't want to do that. So they're starting to think about that in a new kind of way. I don't know if that totally answers your question, but yeah. So yeah.
Thank you. I'll follow up on that a little bit, then I have another question.
Okay.
That you should check out that op-ed this morning, because I think the point the author was trying to make was not so much that if I voluntarily give up my data, then I should have no expectation of privacy with respect to that data. The concern was that overall, culturally, we're getting to the point where it is so the norms have shifted, so that we're so used to this idea that we have no privacy, that the expectation of privacy has gone down, and therefore what is now reasonable expectation is less reasonable. My question, though, is a follow-up to your other comment about Germany, and that is, I was sort of surprised that most of your talk, almost all of it, was about government intrusions and surveillance, and I actually feel more concerned about corporate surveillance. I have far less trust in corporations generally than in governments generally. And so I'm wondering maybe if you could elaborate a bit more on that angle.
Sure. I mean, I think there's definite reason to be skeptical of corporate behavior. There are lots of corporations that, ranging from things that we use every day, Google, Facebook, other tech companies like that, that their entire business model is based on trafficking in some ways, our data, our behavior online. There are other companies that do the same thing, but that are kind of government contractors. Just not to harp on license plate readers again, I told you it was one of my favorite topics. There's a company in Livermore, California, about an hour's drive east of where I live, that's called Vigilant Solutions, which is a great name. Vigilant Solutions claims to have the world's largest private license plate reader database. They do this by working with tow truck companies and repossession companies nationwide. So they sell little LPR, license plate reader kits, to tow truck companies. And so they're out doing their tow trucking or whatever they do, and they're just scanning. And license plate readers, you might know, can scan at speeds up to 60 plates per second. So they're capturing all kinds of data all over the country, and then they're creating their own database that they're then selling to police all over the country. And again, there's not always great regulation about that. So there's lots of different companies. I was just reading today, somebody sent me a company that I had never even imagined of in Philadelphia that is doing image recognition for weapons. So they're saying, okay, if you're a school or you're a prison or you're a hospital and you're worried about people coming into your establishment with weapons, we're going to run some image recognition on your video feeds to be able to recognize when somebody enters a certain perimeter with a weapon in their hand. That's kind of amazing. But you're right. I think that there's a lot of different directions to go when you think about privacy, whether it's government or corporate. In California, we have a law that is about to go into effect in January called the California Consumer Privacy Act, CCPA. Which was signed into law by the previous governor, Jerry Brown. And right now in the legislative session, currently in California, a number of tech companies are trying to weaken it a little bit. One of the things that it would do is it would regulate online tracking and what's often called third-party behavioral tracking. So for example, like you come to NBC News and you read an article about baseball, and so NBC News advertises to you about the Boston Red Sox. I think that's the baseball team people like here. And so what currently happens is then maybe you go over to ESPN.com, and ESPN.com learns that not you personally, but that your internet behavior suggests that you are interested in the Boston Red Sox, so they also will advertise to the Boston Red Sox to you. The CCPA would not allow that. So it wouldn't allow that transfer of data from one entity to another. It would still allow online advertising, but it wouldn't allow that kind of pervasive tracking in that kind of way, which is really interesting. A number of other states, I don't know about New Hampshire, are currently working on their own versions of this law. And there's been there's been some pushback from the industry saying that, well, if California passes this law and Massachusetts passes this law and New Hampshire does this and Washington does this, we're going to end up with this weirdo patchwork of laws, and that's no good. But what a lot of California privacy activists would say is, well, if the California law goes into effect as it is, that will effectively set a national standard because California is a big state by population, and it seems unlikely that most companies, most websites will make a California version and a non-California version. So that's interesting. So there's definitely movement in that regard. But I agree with you that it is important to look at the actions of private companies because in many instances, whether they're working with the government or not, they affect us all in very similar ways. So I appreciate the question.
Hi, I was just, your talk about license plate readers just makes me think of the Easy Pass things, which I wonder if they are considered license plate readers. And I know that in New Hampshire, you know, they take the little picture of your license plate and then you can, you know, you don't have money, you can pay later because we have your license plate.
Yep.
So that's a lot longer than 3 minutes, and I don't know if it's just the picture that counts. I mean, I don't know how much you know about it, but I'm just curious about that.
Yeah, I'm not sure of the specifics of how it works here, but my guess is that I'd have to double check the specific statute about license plate readers, but I think it's the question of the police, whereas like the toll authority or whatever is not the police. So I think it's that the police specifically can't, law enforcement entities can't capture it for that long. But you're right. As I understand it, the Easy Pass or whatever it's called in different regions works essentially the same way, where they're recognizing, you know, your plate number as being this, and if you don't have the little transponder or whatever, then they can figure out who you are and send you the $6 bill or whatever it is. So yeah. Question over here. Mike is coming.
Yeah, I just had a quick question about sort of informed consent in giving up privacy of data. So like researchers at the college and in other universities, if you're recruiting participants, you have to make sure that you get informed consent so they know exactly what's going to happen.
Right.
Whereas it feels like, you know, just ticking these corporate boxes and like giving your data to essentially research teams, you know, Google and Facebook and all of that, has a very, very different standard that it's being held to. I was just wondering what you kind of think of that and what are like good ways to, I don't know, I suppose educate people about what their data can do.
Yeah, I mean, so I think informed consent is a great idea, but that it doesn't get practiced in, I would say, the best of ways. A good example of that is a website that I don't know if some of you are familiar with this website called Flickr. So Flickr was a website that was started, I don't know, 12, 15 years ago. That was a photo sharing website. I used it for a long time. This was like, you know, before Instagram and stuff. Like people would upload their photos and it did some nice like auto resizing and tags and had a bunch of nice features. Yahoo bought it and ruined it. But so a lot of people had a lot of photos on Flickr. I had thousands of photos on Flickr going back many, many years. And a lot of people used Flickr to post their images under something called a Creative Commons license. If you're not familiar with what that means, a Creative Commons license basically says, yeah, I allow my images or my writing or some intellectual property, something that I created, and I allow it to be shared freely under certain conditions that whoever uses it also continues those conditions. And basically it's this idea of kind of, open source, sharing, transparency, free love of data, all of that good stuff, like doing it in a cool and crunchy way. And specifically the license that I used on my images was a Creative Commons attribution non-commercial license. So if you were not a company and you attributed it to me, it was cool to like republish it on your blog back when that was a thing to do, right? Fine. Yahoo packaged millions of photos gathered from Flickr under the Creative Commons license and just like gave them out to researchers. There's like, hey, here's 10 million photos from Flickr. They didn't tell anybody that they did it. They just did it. There was like an announcement if you knew where to look on the Yahoo website, but it's not like every Flickr user got an email being like, hey, by the way, we did this. Then a couple years later, IBM said, oh, we can one-up you. We're going to take your millions of photos and we're going to shrink it down to 1 million, and we're going to run it through some facial recognition analysis, and we're going to use these photos as essentially trading data for facial recognition. And so they did that, and again, IBM didn't tell anybody. In order to get access to this database, you had to be a researcher. IBM wouldn't give it to journalists like me and my colleagues. But very recently, just a few weeks ago, my colleague Olivia Solon obtained a leaked copy of this database from IBM and wrote about that they were doing this. And I said, hey, I've been a Flickr user for a long time. Are my images in this data set? Yeah, they are. There's like 6 of them. There's a dumb picture of me wearing a silly chef's hat holding pizza dough in my hands. And that apparently was used to train who knows kinds of facial recognition. Was I given informed consent? No. Was I notified in any meaningful way? No. I think that kind of violates the spirit of what Creative Commons was about. I did not anticipate that my images would be used to train facial recognition for the benefit of a private company like IBM. So what did I do? I took down my entire image set from Flickr. And that's kind of sad because, yeah, there was a lot of dumb, fun photos of me from 10 years ago that I like to share with friends. But I don't like the idea of my image, my own face, the image of my brother, my wife, my grandparents being used to train facial recognition in this way. So I agree with you that that's really important. And I think that if companies are going to be using people's data in this way, that they should not bury it either in announcements that nobody reads or in the bottom of privacy policies that nobody reads, that there should be some sort of conspicuous, obvious way to say, hey, we're doing this thing now. And if you don't want to be part of it, here's how to opt out, or here's how to delete, or whatever. But I agree with you that the lessons from informed consent from universities, I think, should apply much more on the internet than they do now. In the back.
Hi.
Hi.
I did 5 minutes worth of research on your name, but before coming here, but I did run into an issue actually in the blurb here that you were voted out of Wikipedia.
Yes, I was.
And I was wondering if you could elaborate on that. Were there drones from St. Petersburg involved, or what?
No. This is a story from a long time ago. Back in 2005, I think it was, I wrote an article for Slate about a long-forgotten, very short-lived internet hoax called greenlighting. There was some college students, including one at the University of Michigan, who decided that it would be hilarious to convince idiots in the media like me that the hot new, sex trend amongst college students was greenlighting. What did greenlighting mean? Greenlighting meant that you were going out in the world wearing green polo shirts with the collar turned up, and that meant that you were, down for various sexual activities. This was totally fake and never happened, but they created an entire message board with the sole purpose of, as the kids would say now, trolling the media, of just like tricking the media into believing that this was real. So what I did was I wrote an article about this and said, hey, this is what these guys are doing. It's a hoax. It's all fake, whatever. And I thought that was the end of it. In that article, I had a throwaway line that was something like, I created a Wikipedia entry about myself. Why haven't you? It was just this kind of like jokey line, which was actually true. I actually did create a Wikipedia entry about myself because, it's in the spirit of Wikipedia, apparently. But what I didn't know is that that's like one of the cardinal rules of Wikipedia, that you can't create your own thing because, that's because I guess there's limited space on Wikipedia for some. No, there isn't, but you know what I'm saying. They're very particular, Wikipedians. I love them, but they have their own kind of cultural values and such. And one of them is apparently not creating your own Wikipedia entry. So I was voted for deletion. So this is how you remove something from Wikipedia, is you go through this process called a VfD, a vote for deletion. You get voted off Wikipedia, basically. So I survived 4 votes for deletion. So there were 4 rounds of voting where people said, this guy, created an article about himself, and also he's not famous enough. He doesn't deserve to be on Wikipedia. Literally every episode, I love Star Trek, but literally every episode of Star Trek is on Wikipedia, in great detail. So I was voted off Wikipedia, and then I was briefly added back, and then I was deleted again. So I was deleted. So I've deleted, unless it's changed recently. I've been deleted from English language Wikipedia. I found out a couple years ago that some person who speaks the Occitan language from the southern part of France, which doesn't have very many speakers, like maybe tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands, somebody wrote an Occitan language entry on Occitan Wikipedia about me. I don't speak Occitan, but that's cool. So if you feel so inclined and so inspired, you think I deserve to be on English language or whatever other language you speak, Wikipedia, feel free to go forth and enter that on there for the record. Yeah, it's just kind of a hilarious episode from the internet from many years ago.
Who did the actual voting?
Yeah, it's just like the people who care enough to for that particular entry. I mean, you could, if you were active in the community, you can argue why anything should be removed from Wikipedia. And there's a discussion, and they have a very convoluted process of how that works. But yeah, they have their own particular culture to Wikipedia. So that's how it goes.
All right, last question.
So my question is about 5G.
Okay.
So have you sort of looked into that? And I
Only
guess
a little bit, but yeah, go ahead.
Okay. And I guess what are any additional concerns related to privacy and surveillance? If you've thought about
well, I
that?
think the biggest concern with 5G, right? So this is this new mobile standard that's going to go into effect pretty soon, right? So if you've had a cell phone over the last 10 years, you've probably noticed that your data connection has gotten a lot better. You can now, watch YouTube or whatever on your phone, whereas if you imagine the phone that you had, I don't know, 5 years ago, it's probably more difficult to do. So 5G, as I understand it, is going to be significantly better in terms of giving people faster and better data access. I think there's concern that the particular radios are developed, a lot of them are developed by Huawei, the Chinese company, and so I think there's concern that Huawei is not trustworthy, and so we should be wary of that, and who controls the standard and who controls the hardware. You can tell me this is wrong. This is I think I've exhausted all that I know about 5G, but I think that's the crux of it, I think. And that comes from a national security perspective, that the Chinese government is essentially controls Huawei and other large Chinese companies in doing that, and so we should just be wary of that development. Also economic disparities. Okay, so yeah, so you guys are smarter than me. But yeah, I think that's something that we'll be seeing how that pans out. I don't know of any phones in this country that are available that have 5G radios yet, but that'll probably happen soon, I think.
All right, well, let's Bruce surrender.
All right.